Museum workers in Krasnoyarsk were astonished when they digitalized local photos from the early 1900s, only to find an identical figure in all of them. A solemn girl, dressed in all white, striking an identical pose. So far, the mystery girl has been found in at least 20 photos and 4 glass negatives, which researchers at the Krasnoyarsk Regional Museum of Local Lore believe were taken between 1906 and 1908, judging from the state of the buildings in the photos. In most of the landscape shots, the girl plays no obvious role, standing in the background next to several lower-class children, or at one point on a rooftop in front of a railway bridge in the Siberian city. After releasing a series of postcards pointing out the girl, the museum hopes locals may help identify her, if that is even possible, considering the social upheavals that had occurred in Russia since. So far, no one has come forward. 26th, 1900, a supply ship arrived at the Elian Moor Lighthouse to find that no one was at the dock waiting for them. The island's only inhabitants were the lighthouse keepers, James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and William MacArthur. Captain James Harvey was in charge of the supply ship and had brought along Joseph Moore, a replacement lighthouse keeper. After attempts at getting the lighthouse keepers using the ship's horn and a flare, Joseph decided to go up to the lighthouse to check things out. When he reached the lighthouse, he immediately knew something was wrong because the door was unlocked and 2 of the 3 coats were missing in the entrance hall. As he reached the kitchen, he noticed a half-eaten meal and an overturned chair as if someone had left in a hurry. After searching the lighthouse top to bottom, Joseph hadn't found signs of the lighthouse keepers. A further investigation was made and found mysterious entries in the lighthouse log. December 12th, Thomas Marshall noted of severe winds. He also noted that James Ducat, the principal keeper, had been very quiet and that William MacArthur had been crying. The strange thing is that on the mainland, MacArthur had been known as a tough guy and a seasoned mariner. December 13th noted that the storm was still raging on and that the 3 men had been praying. It's strange because all 3 men were seasoned mariners and situated about 150 feet above sea level. They should have known they'd be safe. So why would they be praying for the storm to pass over? The final log entry on December 15th read, "Storm ended, sea calm, God is over all." Stranger is that there are no reported storms in the area on the 12th, 13th, and 14th of December. In fact, the weather in that area had been reported as calm. The most accepted theory is that the men were swept into the sea and drowned. However, questions arose about why the bodies had never washed up on shore, as well as some others. On September 16, 1922, 2 teenage lovers were out on a stroll when they discovered the bodies of a man and a woman lying under a crab apple tree. Both the man and the woman were dead. The man was shot once, the woman 3 times. The bodies had been posed. Both the man's and the woman's feet were pointed towards the apple tree. The man's hand was on the woman's neck and hers on his knee. The man's card was propped against his foot. A hat concealed the man's head, and a scarf was wrapped around the woman's neck. It was later discovered that the woman's tongue had been cut out. Torn love letters were scattered all around them. The bodies were those of Reverend Edward Wheeler Hall and Eleanor Reinhardt Mills. The 2 had been lovers, but their affair was a complicated one. Mills was married to a church's janitor, and Hall was married to a wealthy woman named Frances Stevens Hall, the main murder suspect. The crime scene was contaminated by souvenir hunters, and thus the police had nothing solid to go on until Jane Gibson, better known as the Pig Woman, came forward. She was a hog farmer who lived near the crime scene. Gibson said that she heard a noise on the night of September 14 and saw someone in her cornfield. Figuring it was a thief, she saddled her mule and rode in pursuit, but instead came upon a parked car. There she heard a bitter argument between 2 men and 2 women. A woman's voice yelled, "Explain these letters." Then there were gunshots, shrieks, and a woman screaming. Frightened, Gibson galloped home. Authorities declared jealousy the motive, and suspicion soon fell upon Edward Hall's wife and her 2 brothers. The murder trial lasted 30 days. While Mrs. Hall and her brothers had both motive and means, they were ultimately acquitted of the murders, due largely to a lack of adequate evidence. While most historians now believe that Mrs. Hall and her 2 brothers were the guilty parties, the case has officially never been solved. In the 1990s, a homemade VHS circulated around called Grave Robbing for Morons. It features a young man explaining how to rob graves without getting caught, what bones are most valuable, and other grave robbing tips. In the video, it shows what appears to be an actual human skull that he's stolen, and at the end he gives the nicknames of himself and his grave robbing crew, Anthony, Gino, Taco, and Poochie, and vows to continue robbing graves for the fun of it. To this day, no one knows who made the video or who the narrator is. There is a site dedicated to finding out the origin of the video and the identity of the narrator, but they don't have any additional information to add. Because of the over-the-top nature of some of the advice, some believe that the video is an act intended to cash in on the pseudo-reality television craze that was going on thanks to things like Faces of Death. But others seem to think that at the very least, the narrator has robbed graves, and that this could be a legit video. On August 7, 1972, 16-year-old high school student Jeanette De Palma told her mom she was going out to visit a friend. When she didn't return that evening, her worried mother called the police, who discovered she had never made it to her friend's house. 6 weeks later, a dog walking in the woods near Jeanette's home in Springfield, New Jersey, ran back to its owner with a badly decomposed arm. The grisly find led to police discovering the teenager's body nearby, and sparked a mystery embroiled in rumors of witchcraft and satanic rituals, which remains unsolved to this day. Jeanette's body was found on a ridge known as the Devil's Teeth, and local witnesses said it was surrounded by a series of strange occult objects, with the remains of dead animals hanging from nearby trees. Although wildly different accounts exist of the murder scene, the most consistent detail was that the body was inside a coffin-shaped structure made from fallen branches and logs, with several makeshift crosses around it. According to post-mortem report, the exact cause of death could not be determined, and a likely cause was listed as strangulation. A toxicology report found no trace of drugs, but a high level of lead, which was all.
February 23, 1991, a young woman's body was found in Goose Lake Wildlife Preserve in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, by a guy walking his dog. She was partly decomposed, yet obvious signs of trauma were still visible. She had been severely battered about the head and chest, and her throat had been slashed. Her legs were spread and her shirt pulled up to expose her breasts. She had been sexually assaulted after death. Strangely, her hands had been severed and were later recovered by hunters, lacking fingertips. On March 15, 1991, a morgue photograph was downloaded into a computer, and a visual image of what the young woman might have looked like in life was created to assist detectives with identifying her remains. The sad story received national coverage, but no leads were forthcoming. Weeks later, a woman who had seen the poster of her believed she might know the identity of the dead girl. The woman informed police she believed this girl had been seen with a pimp named Joseph White. In 1990, White had recruited a young woman to work for him. One day she vanished. The woman had run away from a group home and straight into the arms of Joseph White. The group home's administrator saw the photographs of the missing girl, and she identified her as 16-year-old Doris Ann McLeod. Police discovered that McLeod was sexually abused as a child and eventually lived in 17 foster homes. From the beginning, McLeod experienced problems with White. She didn't want to prostitute herself. It wasn't the life she hoped to find in the city. June 18, 1991, detectives arrived at White's house in a Milwaukee inner-city neighborhood. They entered by the front door, but cowardly White exited by the back, leaving his 3-year-old son behind. Inside the filthy, unkempt house, police discovered clothes and jewelry belonging to McLeod. However, this evidence remains largely circumstantial. White's 3-year-old son suddenly tugged on the flashlight on a detective's belt, curious about the object. He wanted to play with it. When the child, Joseph Jr., was shown a picture of McLeod, he said, "That's Dee." He told the officers that the monster in the house hurt her. Little Joseph Jr. led the police downstairs to McLeod's makeshift bedroom. He pointed the flashlight to steam pipes in the ceiling and explained that he saw Dee hanging from the pipes, telling the men how the monster had bit her fingers. This is crucial evidence, as McLeod's hand was found missing her fingertips, information that was never released to the public. The adorable little boy then stated, "I heard the monster. God damn it, why don't you go upstairs? Now get out of here." Detectives believed this was where McLeod was tortured and possibly killed. Upstairs, they found a pad of paper on which there was a gang pad, but it contained the rules for the gang. They read on this pad that 50 to the chest was the punishment for a girl who no longer wanted to be a prostitute, and that this was conducive to the wounds on Doris's body. Joseph White was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole until he's 108 years old. 31st, 1989, Noreen Boyle, wife of a popular and charismatic doctor in Mansfield, Ohio, disappeared. Noreen had been married to her husband, John Boyle, for 22 years. They have a son, 11-year-old Collier, and 2.5-years-old Elizabeth, who they adopted from Taiwan. A good friend of Noreen reported her missing when she hadn't shown up for their lunch date. Police investigating her disappearance found that John Boyle had numerous affairs during their marriage, and that he had bought a house in Erie, Pennsylvania for his pregnant mistress, intending to move in. Police also found that Noreen had asked for a divorce prior to her disappearance. Police suspected it's more than a missing persons case and believed Noreen is probably a victim of foul play, so they interviewed Collier privately about the night his mother disappeared. Collier said that at about 3:15 a.m. of December 31st, he heard his parents arguing, and then later he heard a big thud coming from the room of his parents. Shortly after that, he heard his father walking down the hallway towards his room. He said his father opened his door, looking at him for a long period of time as if he was checking on him. Collier pretended to be asleep. The next morning, his father told him that his mother had left on a vacation. Collier also said that after his mother went missing, his father went on back-and-forth trips from their home in Mansfield to his new house in Erie, Pennsylvania, and that after his father came back from Erie, his shoulder and arms were very sore, and he asked Collier to rub liniment oil on him. Police checked on local businesses and found that John rented a jackhammer and had also purchased a roll of indoor-outdoor carpet a few days before Noreen disappeared. The retailer who sold John's new home in Erie told investigators that he asked to lower the floor in the basement so his kids could play basketball. 26 days after Noreen disappeared, police got a search warrant for John Boyle's new home in Erie, Pennsylvania. They went to check the basement, where they saw the floor had been recently painted gray and new shelves installed at one end. When police went looking around, they noticed the floor was recently filled with concrete and that it's soft, so they pulled up the carpet and began digging. Police found Noreen's badly decomposed body, her head covered with a plastic bag and wearing a Rolex watch. The watch had stopped on December 31st, the day Noreen disappeared. Police concluded that John struck Noreen in the head and suffocated her by putting a plastic bag over her head. John Boyle was arrested, and his son Collier testified against him in 1990. He was found guilty of the murder and was sentenced to life in prison. 2011, 22-year-old Victoria Perez, who was due to give birth in about a month, disappeared after a doctor's visit at Rapide Regional Medical Center in Louisiana. Victoria was last seen walking on Interstate 49 at the Woodworth exit on March 11th. The day before, she was seen at the Rapide Regional Medical Center. After the appointment, Victoria called the van transportation company to pick her up and bring her home. The van was delayed, and by the time they got there, Victoria was gone. The case remained cold until January 2015, when the Allen Parish Sheriff's Office received a tip that led them to a home on Matthew Street in Oakdale. It was there that her remains were found. It all began when a woman named Pamela Causey Fregia was desperate to stop her husband from leaving. She claimed she was pregnant, and she showed him a fake pregnancy test. He didn't believe her and moved to another state. Causey Fregia continued with her lie, sending him fake sonogram photos. Months passed, and Causey Fregia realized she needed a child. She traveled to a hospital with her daughter and tried to find an infant. Instead, she found Victoria Perez, who was 8 months pregnant. Causey Fregia lured Perez to her home with the promise of free baby clothes. When the pair arrived, Causey Fregia killed Perez by blunt force. She then tried to cut the baby out of Perez but failed. Kazi Fregia took Perez's body down the road to a wooded, family-owned property. She spent several days burning the body, and then she burned the remains. 4 years later, Kazi Fregia's own children turned her into the police. Police sent cadaver dogs around the property, and they discovered Perez's remains. Kazi Fregia was charged with first-degree murder and first-degree feticide. February 2, 1991, a 78-year-old grandmother named Lucille Johnson was found bludgeoned to death in her Holiday, Utah home. According to police reports, she was found dead by her daughter the very next day, and her body had been battered and her bloodied face was covered with a pillow. Interestingly, investigators at the time found Lego bricks on Johnson's living room floor, in the home's entry, and on the driveway. Detectives collected the toys as evidence after family members told them that while Johnson had toys for her grandchildren, she would never leave them lying around. Investigators also learned that a ring and necklace Johnson regularly wore were missing. An autopsy revealed that Johnson died from strangulation and blunt force trauma. Salt Lake County Sheriff's investigators worked on the case but were unable to solve it. In August 2013, a team led by Unified Police Sergeant Michael Ike Miyashiro reopened the case. The detectives sent scrapings that had been collected from under Johnson's fingernails for DNA testing, and recovered a profile that matched a combined DNA index system profile for a 47-year-old John Sansing, a man who is currently in prison in Arizona for another murder committed in 1997. Investigators also matched fingerprints from the Lego toys gathered during the original investigation with one of Sansing's children, who was 5 years old at the time of the killing. Police believed that the child was used to gain entry, and that Sansing and Johnson previously did not know one another. The body of a woman was discovered in an Ohio river, under ice. She had been strangled to death, and most of the evidence had been washed away by the rushing water. A check of missing persons reports identified the woman as 32-year-old Margie Coffey, a single mother of 2 young children. She had been reported missing 10 days earlier. The autopsy revealed that she had been strangled with her own scarf. The coroner estimated she had been dumped in the creek 10 days earlier, the same day she disappeared. Police investigating the case found that Margie had a relationship with a married police officer named Charles Oswald. And investigators who examined Margie's body and clothing discovered some fibers found on her leg warmers that matched the unique carpeting in Charles's cop car that night. But this evidence is just circumstantial. Police wonder, what is the motive? Police found out that when Margie applied for financial aid at college, she was required to identify her second child's father. She named Charles Oswald as the father. A paternity test was administered and came out to be 99.98% positive. Investigators also discovered that Charles had refused to pay for child support when Margie asked. Another woman who claimed to be Charles's new mistress said that Charles told her about the murder of Margie Coffey. She stated that Charles and Margie were together in a car talking about child support. Charles offered Margie $3,000, but she said it's not enough. Charles got angry and started to yell, calling her obscene names, and she responded by slapping him across the face. Charles then reached over and strangled Margie in the cop car and put her lifeless body into the back seat of the car. He then drove to a creek nearby and threw her over a bridge, in hopes that all the forensic evidence would wash away downstream. Charles Oswald was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter and abusing a corpse. He was sentenced to 10 to 25 years in prison.